"You're exactly what I prayed for," the Virgin Mountain Man said when the obese Amish teen bride arrived. The dusty stagecoach door creaks open. Out steps a trembling young bride, cast away by her own family. Waiting in the dirt street is a giant mountain man alone, his whole life, desperate for someone to call his own. He doesn't laugh. He doesn't turn away. Instead, he claims her with words so tender, the whole town stops in shock. But whispers rise on the boardwalk papers. Missing, a rival rancher hungry for land, and a sheriff who may not stand on the side of justice. Their marriage might not even be legal. And when torches gather at their cabin door, love itself is put on trial. Can two outcasts, bound by prayer and faith, stand against a world set on tearing them apart? Or will the home they've just begun to build burn to the ground before it ever truly starts? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The morning mist hung low over Lancaster County as the wagon wheels creaked against the packed dirt road. Miriam Stoltzfus sat rigid beside her father, her hands clutching her worn psalter, hymnal until her knuckles turned white. The book's familiar leather binding offered little comfort as she watched her childhood home disappear into the dawn shadows. Through the thin walls of her bedroom the night before, she had heard the whispers. Too big, too shy, unsuitable. The words had cut deeper than any knife. Now, as the wagon jolted toward the railway station, those same words echoed in her mind like a cruel chorus. Her father hadn't spoken a word since they'd left, his stern face set like stone beneath his broad-brimmed hat. The silence between them stretched vast as the distance she was about to travel. Miriam's throat tightened as she thought of her mother's tearful farewell, the quick embrace that felt more like goodbye than God be with you. The train station emerged through the morning haze, its wooden platform already busy with travelers. Her father handed her a packet of papers and a train ticket without meeting her eyes. "The broker has arranged everything," he said gruffly. "Your intended will meet you in Colorado." Colorado. The word itself sounded foreign, distant as the moon. Miriam's hands trembled as she took the papers, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to beg to stay, but years of obedience sealed her lips. The train's whistle pierced the morning air, sharp and insistent. Miriam climbed aboard, her simple black dress drawing curious glances from other passengers. As the train lurched forward, she pressed her face to the window, watching her father's figure grow, smaller until he vanished completely. Days blurred together as the landscape changed outside her window. The familiar green hills of Pennsylvania gave way to vast prairies, then to towering mountains that scraped the sky. Through it all, Miriam held tight to her psalter, its pages worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. She whispered the familiar words to herself, finding solace in their rhythm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But want she did. She wanted home. She wanted acceptance. She wanted to understand why she wasn't enough. The stagecoach that carried her, the final leg of her journey, rattled and swayed over rough mountain roads. Dust seeped through every crack, coating her clothes and skin in a fine layer of grit. Other passengers complained loudly about the discomfort, but Miriam remained silent, preparing herself for the mockery she was sure awaited her at journey's end. When the coach finally pulled into the small Colorado town, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Miriam's legs shook as she descended the coach steps, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. The dust swirled around her ankles, and she could hear the murmur of voices, the usual small town. Curiosity about a newcomer. "Miss Stoltzfus?" The voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder without the threat of storm. Miriam forced herself to look up and up and up still more. Before her stood the tallest man she'd ever seen, broad-shouldered and strong as a mountain. Himself, but it was his eyes that caught and held her attention, deep brown and filled with such naked emotion that she couldn't look away. The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with sun-bleached streaks. His hands, large and work-roughened, trembled slightly as they gripped the hat's brim. Tears gleamed in his eyes, catching the last rays of sunlight. "You're exactly what I prayed for," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Miriam felt the world stop spinning for a moment. The words hung in the air between them, sincere and startling as a sunrise. Around them, she was dimly aware of other passengers staring, of the station master pausing in his work to gawk at the scene unfolding before him. The mountain man, her intended, she realized with a start, seemed unaware of their audience. He took a step closer, moving with the careful grace of someone used to his own strength. "I'm Enoch Hart," he said softly, "and I've been waiting for you." A warmth bloomed in Miriam's chest, foreign and frightening in its intensity. This giant of a man looked at her not with the dismissal she'd grown accustomed to, but with a reverence that made her want to weep. He saw her, truly saw her, and found no fault. Enoch reached for her carpetbag, his movements gentle despite his size. "Welcome home," he said, and in those two simple words, Miriam heard everything her heart had been longing to hear. Enoch offered his arm to Miriam as they made their way down the dusty boardwalk. His massive frame seemed to shield her from the curious stares and whispered comments that followed in their wake. Through the wooden slats, Miriam could hear fragments of conversation from the townsfolk. Mountain Man finally found himself a wife, girls twice the size of most, simple as a child, that Enoch Hart. But Enoch appeared unbothered, his steps steady and purposeful as he guided her past the general store and saloon. His calloused hand patted hers where it rested in the crook of his arm, as if sensing her discomfort. "Preacher Watson's just up ahead," he said softly. "Been expecting us before sunset." The small white church sat at the edge of town, its steeple reaching toward the golden Colorado sky. Preacher Watson met them at the door, a thin man with kind eyes and silver hair. He ushered them inside without ceremony. "The Lord brings together those meant to find each other," the preacher said, opening his Bible. The blessing was brief but sincere, the words echoing in the empty church as Enoch and Miriam exchanged simple vows. When they finished, Enoch's "I, too" came out strong and clear, while Miriam's was barely more than a whisper. Afterward, Miriam gathered her courage. "I could cook us a proper meal," she offered, her voice stronger now. To mark the occasion, Enoch's face brightened. "The boarding house has a kitchen we can use. Mrs. Peterson said it would be fine." In the boarding house kitchen, Miriam struggled with the heavy cast iron pots, determined not to show weakness. Her arms trembled as she lifted a water-filled kettle. But she refused help. This was her chance to prove her worth as a wife. She had brought her own collection of precious spices, carefully wrapped in paper, and soon the kitchen filled with the familiar scents of her childhood home. Enoch watched her work with obvious admiration. "Smells like heaven itself," he said. Inhaling deeply, they ate their wedding supper at a small table in the corner of the kitchen. Simple fare of chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. Enoch cleaned his plate twice, each bite taken with reverent appreciation that brought color to Miriam's cheeks as the sun began to set. They loaded Miriam's trunk into Enoch's wagon. The vehicle was well maintained but worn, like everything Alcee owned. He helped her onto the high seat with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. The horses set off at a steady pace, hooves clocking against the hard-packed dirt road. The town fell away behind them as they headed toward the foothills. In the gathering dusk, Enoch began to speak, his voice mixing with the creak of wagon wheels. "Been praying for a wife for 3 years now," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Not just any wife. Someone kind. Someone who wouldn't mock me for being slow with words. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Words don't come easy to me. Never have. Some folks think that means I'm simple. Miriam listened, amazed by his openness. Here was a man who shared his vulnerabilities without shame, who spoke his truth plainly and without guile. I reckon we both know what it's like, he continued, being judged before folks take time to know us proper. The moon was rising when they finally reached Enoch's homestead. His cabin stood solid against the backdrop of pine-covered hills, smoke curling from the stone chimney into the night sky. He had clearly prepared for her arrival. The cabin windows glowed with lamplight, and fresh-cut flowers sat in a tin can on the porch. Inside, the cabin was small but neat. A rope bed stood in one corner, a pot-bellied stove in another. Enoch carried in her trunk while Miriam unpacked her few possessions. She carefully spread her wedding quilt across the bed, the one thing her mother had insisted she take. The simple pattern of blue and white squares seemed to brighten the whole room. Enoch watched as she removed her psalter from her carpet bag. Without a word, he took the book and placed it reverently beside his own Bible on a rough-hewn shelf. "Reckon they belong together," he said softly, "just like us." Night settled fully around the cabin. They moved awkwardly in the small space, adjusting to each other's presence. Enoch trimmed the lamp while Miriam changed behind a curtain she had hung for privacy. When she emerged in her nightdress, he had already laid out his bedroll on the floor. "Good night, wife," he said, his voice warm in the lamplight. "Good night, husband," Miriam replied, testing the new word on her tongue. The lamp was extinguished, and darkness wrapped around them like a blanket. In the quiet night, two hearts beat in rhythm, not yet one flesh, but already one in spirit, blessed by God and anchored in their new life together. Dawn crept through the cabin's single window, painting golden stripes across the rough-hewn floor. Miriam blinked awake, her body stiff from the unfamiliar bed. Enoch's bedroll already lay empty, neatly folded beside the stove. Outside, his boots crunched on gravel as he headed toward the creek with two wooden buckets. Miriam rose quietly, smoothing her dress and reaching for her apron. The morning air held a mountain chill that made her shiver as she moved to the small kitchen area. Opening the flour bin, her heart sank. Only a thin layer of cornmeal dusted the bottom, barely. Enough for a morning meal. The root cellar proved equally sparse. A few wrinkled potatoes, one salt pork joint, and half a sack of beans dod. She measured the cornmeal carefully, stirring it into cold water to prevent lumps. As the mixture heated on the cook stove, Enoch returned, water sloshing in his buckets. His smile warmed her more than the morning sun. "Smells good already," he said, setting down his load. They ate their modest breakfast in comfortable silence, sharing the small table. Afterward, Enoch led her outside to show her the work that needed doing. The woodpile had dwindled dangerously low. "Winter comes early up here," he explained, hefting his axe. "Got to be ready." Miriam insisted on helping, though her arms trembled as she carried splits to the stack. Enoch's powerful swings made quick work of the logs, his movement sure and practiced. Between loads, they drew more water from the creek, filling every available barrel and bucket. Back inside, Miriam turned her attention to the cabin itself. Years of bachelor living had left their mark. Dust in corners, cobwebs in rafters, tools scattered where they'd last been used. She tied back her hair and set to work with determination, finding satisfaction in bringing order to chaos. In a corner cupboard, she discovered a small wooden box, worn smooth with handling. Inside lay carefully folded scraps of faded calico, edged with simple embroidery. Enoch found her studying them. "Ma's apron," he said softly, touching the fabric with reverent fingers. She taught me my letters from that pattern before the fever took her and Pa both. I was just a boy. Miriam's heart ached at the loneliness in his voice. How did you manage? She asked. The Lord provided, he answered simply. Learned to trap, to farm a bit. Neighbors helped some, till they moved on. He carefully closed the box, but mostly just me and God since then. By afternoon, their morning's work had transformed the cabin, but their lack of supplies couldn't be ignored. They hitched the wagon for a trip to town, bumping along the rutted trail as the sun westered behind them. The mercantile's bell jangled as they entered. Miriam felt the familiar weight of stairs as she moved between the crowded shelves. She focused. On her list, flour, sugar, salt, coffee, while whispers followed them like shadows dotted the counter. A man's sharp voice cut through the murmur. Well, if it ain't the mountain man and his new bride. Silas Keller stood blocking their path, his expensive boots and silver watch marking him as a man of means. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he looked Miriam up and down. Reckon you got yourself more mouth to feed than help hard, he drawled. Shame, that. Color flooded Enoch's face. His hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. Mr. Keller, he said with careful politeness, I'd thank you to show my wife proper respect. Keller's laugh drew more attention. Respect? For what? Girls liable to eat you out of house and home before winter's done. Miriam's chest tightened as though gripped by iron bands. She clutched her purchase list until the paper crumpled. Enoch placed himself between her and Keller's cruel gaze. We'll take our business elsewhere, he said quietly, leading Miriam toward the door. Laughter followed them out onto the boardwalk. The ride home passed in heavy silence. Miriam's tears finally broke free as they reached the cabin, spilling down her cheeks as she stumbled inside. Enoch found her by the stove, shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm just a burden to you. Everyone can see it. Enoch knelt beside her. Chair. Gently, he took her hand and pressed it against his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady. Feel that? He asked. That's strength, and it's stronger with you here. His eyes held hers, earnest and sure. You make me strong, Miriam. Don't matter what anyone says. Fresh tears fell, but these were different. Tears of gratitude, of belonging. Enoch's large hand covered hers where it rested against his heart, anchoring her in the truth of his words. The days flowed together like water in the creek behind their cabin. Each morning brought new lessons as Enoch and Miriam settled into the gentle rhythm of frontier life. The mountain air grew crisp with autumn's approach, painting the aspens gold against the evergreens. One clear morning, Enoch led Miriam down to the creek, carrying 2 rough-carved fishing poles. She watched, fascinated, as his big hands deftly threaded a worm onto the hook. Like this, he demonstrated, his movements careful and precise. The fish, they can tell if you're hasty about it. Miriam's first attempt sent the worm sliding off into the water, but Enoch's patience never wavered. When she finally managed to secure one properly, his proud smile warmed her deeper than the morning sun. They sat together on the creek bank, poles propped on forked sticks. Miriam's skirts spread neat around her on the grass, while Enoch pointed out the deeper pools where trout liked to hide. The peaceful sound of running water filled the air between them down in the evenings. Lamplight pooled golden on the cabin floor as Miriam bent over her sewing. Enoch's work trousers had worn thin at the knees and seat, requiring careful patches. Her needle flashed steadily, drawing neat stitches through the heavy fabric while Enoch read aloud from his Bible, his deep voice gentle in the quiet room. When Sunday dawned, they borrowed old Jonas Weber's mule for the ride into town. The creature's gait wasn't as smooth as a horse, but Enoch led it carefully, mindful of the rutted trail. Miriam held tight to the saddle horn, her best dress protected by a clean quilt across her lap. the little church glowed with welcome, windows bright with morning sun and lamplight both. Hymns spilled out into the crisp air as they approached. Inside, rough-hewn pews held a mix of townfolk and outlying settlers, all in their Sunday best. Miriam's voice joined the familiar tunes, though the words here were English instead of her childhood German. The simple melodies carried her heart upward just the same. Enoch sang beside her, his bass somewhat uncertain but earnest. The preacher took his place behind the simple pulpit, opening his Bible with care. His sermon text came from the Psalms. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. As the message unfolded, speaking of God's attention to the lonely and outcast, Miriam found herself trembling. Memories of her father's stern dismissal mingled with the preacher's words about divine acceptance. Enoch's warm hand found hers, steadying her. After the final hymn, the congregation spilled out into the churchyard. The preacher met them at the door, his handshake warm and firm. "Brother Hart, Sister Miriam," he greeted them, genuine welcome in his voice. "It does my heart. Good to see you both here today." Before they could respond, Silas Keller's smooth voice cut through the pleasant morning air. "Preacher, speaking of seeing them here, have you checked if their marriage is properly recorded? Heard some disturbing rumors about that broke her heart. Wouldn't want any impropriety in your congregation." The words fell like stones into still water. Miriam felt cold despite the autumn sun. Nearby conversations hushed, then resumed in urgent whispers. She caught fragments as they moved toward their borrowed mule. Sheriffs looking into it. Those mail-order arrangements might not be legal at all. The ride home passed in heavy silence. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, matching their mood. By nightfall, thunder rolled through the valley. Rain drumming on the cabin's roof. Miriam sat in her rocking chair, hands idle in her lap, watching Enoch through tear-blurred eyes. He knelt beside their bed, hands clasped, praying aloud for the first time since she'd arrived. "Lord," his voice rose clear above the storm, "you brought us together. You heard my prayers when I was alone. Now I ask you to protect what you've given us. Don't let men's schemes tear apart what you joined." His prayer continued, simple words carrying deep faith. Miriam listened, wonder growing in her heart. It was no elaborate show of religion, but the fierce conviction of a man who had walked alone with God through wilderness years. His faith stood as solid as the mountains themselves, unshaken by human threats. Lightning flashed, illuminating Enoch's bowed head. In that bright moment, Miriam saw past his rough exterior to the pure heart beneath, a heart that had claimed her without reservation, that now fought for their union with the strongest weapons he knew, prayer and trust in God's faithfulness. The Mayas thunder that followed seemed to seal his words like an Amen. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Miriam was already up, kindling crackling in the cook stove as she prepared breakfast. Enoch paused in pulling on his boots, listening to the steady clip-clop growing closer. Sheriff Doyle's Baymar came into view, the lawman's badge catching early light. He dismounted with practiced ease, removing his hat as Enoch stepped onto the porch. "Morning, Hart," the sheriff said, reaching into his vest pocket. "Got business to discuss." Miriam appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. The sheriff's expression tightened when he saw her, and he pulled out a folded telegram. "This came in yesterday," he said, holding out the paper. "Several marriages arranged by your broker, fellow named Jenkins, are being disputed back east. Seems he wasn't as legitimate as folks thought." Enoch took the telegram, his large hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. Miriam pressed closer, her heart thundering against her ribs as she read over his arm. "What does this mean for us?" Enoch's voice was quiet but steady. The sheriff shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Way, The territorial law sees it. Without proper paperwork, there's no legal standing for the marriage. Not until this gets sorted out. He turned to Miriam, his tone gentler. Ma'am, you might want to consider your options. If the marriage isn't valid, no. Enoch's single word cut through the morning air like an axe blade, but Miriam barely heard him. The world spun around her as the sheriff's words echoed in her head. No legal standing. Consider your options. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. Feet and her knees buckled. Strong arms caught her before she hit the porch boards. Enoch gathered her close, his chest solid against her cheek. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard the sheriff mounting up, hoofbeats fading away down the moss. Trail. They'll send me away, Miriam whispered, tears soaking into Enoch's shirt, like my family did. I'll have nowhere. Paper or no paper, you are mine. Enoch's voice rumbled through his chest, fierce and certain. God brought you to me. No man's going to tear us apart. He held her until the tears slowed, then helped her to her feet. The morning sun had climbed higher, reminding them of work waiting to be done. Miriam straightened her shoulders, determination replacing despair. She threw herself into the day's tasks with desperate energy. The Dutch oven needed proper heating in the coals before she could start the bread. She measured flour carefully, working the dough with practiced hands while watching through the window as Enoch climbed onto the roof. The steady rhythm of his hammer driving nails matched the kneading of her hands. The bread rose in its pan while she swept the cabin floor. Hung fresh curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the sheriff's words. When the loaf was ready, she settled it carefully in the preheated Dutch oven, nestling it in the glowing coals dot. By late afternoon, the fresh bread's aroma filled the cabin. Enoch finished the roof repairs just as Miriam pulled the golden brown loaf from the coals. Without discussion, they took their supper outside, settling on the porch steps to eat warm bread spread with precious butter. Meadowlarks called from the nearby grass, their sweet songs carrying on the evening breeze. Miriam and Enoch ate in comfortable silence, trying to pretend this was just another peaceful evening, that no shadow hung over their future. As twilight deepened, they moved inside. Miriam took up her spinning wheel, another rescue from Enoch's mother's belongings that she'd cleaned and repaired. The wheel creaked softly as she fed wool through her fingers, the motion soothing her troubled heart. Without conscious thought, she began to hum. The old hymn rose naturally to her lips, one her grandmother had taught her in German long ago. The familiar melody spoke of God's faithfulness through storms and trials. Enoch sat in his chair by the fire, watching her with wondering eyes. When she finished the hymn, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's the prettiest thing I ever heard," he said softly. "When we get this marriage business settled proper, I want you to sing that hymn when we say our vows again." Miriam's hands stilled on the wheel. "You want to renew our vows?" "Course I do." His smile was gentle in the lamplight. "Want to stand up proper in church and tell everyone what I already know in my heart, that you're my wife, given to me by God himself." Fresh tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks, but these were different from the morning's desperate weeping. These were tears of gratitude, of belonging, of hope. The spinning wheel creaked again as she returned to her work, humming the old hymn once more while Enoch listened, his face glowing with quiet joy. Summer painted the Colorado foothills in waves of golden grass and wildflowers. Morning dew sparkled on spider webs strung between fence posts as Miriam knelt in the freshly turned soil beside their cabin. Her fingers worked carefully, dropping seeds into the shallow furrows she'd made. The earth felt warm and alive against her skin, promising future harvests of beans and squash near the woodpile. Enoch demonstrated how to split kindling, his massive hands dwarfing the hatchet. "Hold it just so," he explained, positioning the stick. "One clean stroke, does it?" The wood split with a satisfying crack. Miriam tried next, her attempts resulting in crooked splits and scattered pieces. Instead of frustration, she found herself giggling at her clumsy efforts. Enoch's deep chuckle joined hers. The sound as warming as summer sunshine. Their laughter continued into the kitchen, where Miriam's first batch of biscuits emerged from the oven dark as thunderclouds. Reckon they're more suitable for throwing than eating, Enoch teased, tapping one against his plate with an audible thunk. Perhaps we could use them to patch the roof, Miriam suggested, and they dissolved into mirth again. Later, as she mended Enoch's work shirt, her stitches wandered like a drunken trail across the fabric. But Enoch declared it perfect, saying the crooked line would remind him of their first summer together. Their contentment shattered one afternoon when hoofbeats approached. Silas Keller rode up to their fence line, his gelding's coat lathered with sweat. The rival rancher's face wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hart," he called out. "Been doing some research in the county records." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Seems your land deed had conditions, regular improvements required. That cabin's barely standing, and I don't see much farming happening." His gaze slid dismissively over Miriam's small garden. "Might be time to consider selling before things get complicated." Enoch's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained steady. "This is our home, Keller. We're not selling. We'll see about that." Keller wheeled his horse around, dust rising from its hooves. "Better check those deed requirements carefully." That evening, they rode into town for the weekly prayer meeting. Miriam's heart felt heavy as they entered the small church, lamplight gleaming on rough-hewn pews. During the singing, she slipped out to fetch water from the pump behind the building. Voices drifted from around the corner. "Poor Enoch Hart," a woman whispered. "Must have been desperate indeed to settle for such a wife. Did you see how she barely fits in the pew? And that dress she wore last week?" another replied, straining at every seam. "No wonder her own people cast her out." The water dipper clattered from Miriam's nerveless fingers. She stumbled backward, tears blurring her vision, and fled behind the church. There, in the deepening twilight, she pressed her face against the rough boards and let the sobs come. Footsteps crunched in the gravel. "Miriam?" Enoch's voice was soft with concern. She couldn't face him. "They're right," she choked out. "I'm not fit to be anyone's wife." That's why the words stuck in her throat, that they had to be said. "That's why my family sent me away. Not for any sin or shame, but because," she drew a shuddering breath, "because I told them I was afraid. Afraid no one would ever choose me, that I'd be alone forever. Better to send me west and bear the shame of an unmarried daughter." Warm, calloused hands cupped her face, turning her gently. Through her tears, she saw Enoch's eyes, bright with something that looked like wonder. "Listen close now," he said, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Chosen or not, God gave you to me. When I prayed for a wife, I asked for someone with a gentle heart, someone who'd work beside me, laugh with me, share my faith." His voice grew husky. "First time I saw you step down from that stage, I knew my prayer was answered." Miriam stared at him, scarcely daring to believe. "But I'm not." "You're exactly what I prayed for," Enoch said firmly. "Those folks in there, they don't see what I see. Don't see how you make this rough country feel like home. How you face each day with courage, no matter what comes." He pressed his forehead to hers. "God didn't make a mistake when he brought you to me." The church bell tolled, calling them back to worship. But for a moment longer, they stood together in the gathering. Dusk, two souls whom God had led across a continent to find each other. And in her heart, Miriam felt something shift and settle, like a key turning in a lock. She wasn't an exile anymore. She was chosen, not by man's wisdom, but by God's perfect plan. The wagon wheels creaked as Enoch guided their team down the way. rutted road toward town. Miriam sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trail, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains dot inside the small church. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, catching motes that danced in the air. The wooden pews were packed tight with townspeople, their Sunday best a patchwork of worn cotton and faded wool. Miriam felt eyes upon her as she and Enoch took their usual seat near the back. Preacher Thompson stood at his rough-hewn pulpit, his Bible open before him. But today, instead of launching into his sermon, he raised his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to every corner. "Today we're doing something special." He gestured for Enoch and Miriam to stand. The Hart family has faced challenges lately, whispers and doubts about their union. Well, I aim to put that right. Miriam's fingers tightened on Enoch's arm as the preacher descended from his platform and stood before them. "Lord," Thompson prayed, his voice strong and clear, "we ask your blessing on this home and marriage. Guard them against false claims, and those who tear asunder what you've joined together. Let their love be a testament to your perfect wisdom." "Amen," the congregation echoed, and Miriam felt tears spring to her eyes at the unexpected support. After the service, standing in the churchyard, Miriam gathered her courage. "We'd be honored," she said to several nearby couples, her voice trembling. "Only slightly, if you join us for supper tomorrow evening." The invitation sparked whispers, but 3 families accepted. On the ride home, Miriam's mind raced with preparations. "I'll need to start the stew early," she murmured, "and the bread must be fresh-baked." Enoch squeezed her hand. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "I know," she replied softly, "but I want to." The next day, Miriam worked from dawn, her movements sure and purposeful in their small kitchen. The Dutch oven bubbled with rich beef stew, onions and carrots from their garden adding flavor. Fresh bread rose in the warm corner by the stove, and she carefully rolled out pie crust for the wild berries Enoch had gathered dot as the sun began its westward slide. Wagon wheels announced their guests' arrival. The Thompsons, Clarks, and Wheelers filed into the cabin, the women carrying small offerings, a jar of preserves, fresh butter, a bunch of late summer flowers. "What a lovely home you've made here," Mrs. Wheeler said, glancing around at the swept floors and curtained windows. The comment seemed to surprise them both. Mrs. Clark inspected the neat stitching on the new cushions Miriam had made. "Fine work," she admitted. "Did you learn this from your mother?" "Yes," Miriam answered, serving the stew in their best bowls. "In our community, we learned homemaking young." The conversation flowed easier over good food. The women praised her light, crusty bread and asked about her pie recipe. Mrs. Thompson shared stories of her own early days as a frontier wife, making Miriam laugh with tales of disasters worse than burned biscuits. "You've done well here, Mrs. Wheeler said as they prepared to leave, her eyes taking in the neat cabin, the growing garden, the carefully tended flower beds. "It's clear you're devoted to making a real home." After the last wagon disappeared down the trail, Miriam knelt by the cabin door. In the soft evening light, she planted the wildflowers their guests had brought, purple coneflowers and bright yellow black-eyed Susans. Her fingers worked the soil gently, giving each plant room to grow strong roots. "I feel it now," she whispered, more to herself than to Enoch, who stood nearby. "I feel like a true wife at last, like this is where I belong." Enoch helped her too, her feet brushing soil from her skirts. Together, they settled on the rough-hewn bench he'd placed to catch the evening light. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of gold and rose, while crickets began their evening chorus in the tall grass. Their clasped hands rested between them, comfortable in the growing quiet. Hope warmed Miriam's heart like the last rays of sunshine on her face. Here, with Enoch's solid presence beside her and their home behind them, she felt at peace. Not just accepted, but truly at home, exactly where God meant her to be. Golden weeks slipped past like water in a stream. Each sunrise brought new tasks shared between husband and wife with growing ease. The late summer air rang with the steady thunk of Enoch's axe as he felled trees for winter fuel. Miriam worked beside him, her strong arms dragging smaller branches to their growing woodpile. "Here," Enoch would say, pausing to show her the proper way to stack logs against the wind. His hand would linger on hers, no longer shy with such touches. Their fingers had grown familiar with each other's calluses, speaking a language of shared labor and quiet devotion in their small cabin. The handmill creaked as they ground corn together. Miriam's shoulders pressed against Enoch's chest while they turned the heavy stone, their movements falling into natural rhythm. The fresh ground meal filled their storage barrel, promising warm bread through cold months ahead. "We'll need more shelves," Miriam observed one morning, studying their crowded pantry. Rows of preserved vegetables lined the existing boards, beans, carrots, and beets from their garden, each jar a testament to their partnership. "Reckon you're right," Enoch agreed, his voice warm with pride. He watched her efficient movements as she checked each seal, counted their stores, and planned for winter's needs. Her confidence had grown steady as summer ripened, like their garden plants taking root in fertile soil. One perfect afternoon, when the air hung sweet with late wildflowers, Enoch surprised Miriam with a picnic. He spread a blanket in their favorite meadow, producing bread, cheese, and late summer apples from his satchel. Grasshoppers chirped in the tall grass around them as they settled in the warm sunshine. "Sometimes," Miriam said softly, watching clouds drift overhead, "I imagine little feet running through this grass." Her hand rested unconsciously on her middle, hope in her eyes. Enoch's broad hand covered hers. "Our children will know love," he promised. "They'll grow strong here, like everything else God's blessed us with." The sweet moment shattered when they returned home. Silas Keller's horse stood tied to their fence post, its rider waiting like a spider in its web. Papers rustled in his hand as he turned to face them. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," Silas drawled, his smile sharp as a knife. Though couple might not be the right word, considering. Enoch stepped forward, placing himself between Silas and Miriam. "State your business and be gone, Keller." Silas held up the papers, letting them catch the late sunlight. "Got some interesting documents here. Seems that marriage broker of yours wasn't just fraudulent, he was criminal. Every contract he arranged is void." His cold eyes fixed on Miriam. "Which means you ain't no wife at all. Just a woman living in sin, cooking and cleaning for nothing." Miriam's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. "Our marriage was blessed. Before God. God don't hold up in court, ma'am." Silas's smile widened. "And speaking of legal matters, I've had my lawyer looking into your land claim. Hart. Seems there were some irregularities. By rights, this whole spread should revert to open territory." He patted the papers. "Or to someone who knows how to file proper paperwork." Enoch's muscles coiled like a spring, but Miriam's touch on his arm held him still. Violence would only prove Silas right, that they were illegitimate, uncivilized. "Get off our land," Enoch said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your land?" Silas laughed, mounting his horse. "We'll see about that. Better start packing, woman. Ain't gonna be your kitchen much longer." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake. The beautiful day had turned bitter as gall. That evening, after supper, neither could eat. Miriam slipped outside. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky as she knelt in the dirt beside her garden. For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, since being cast out by her family, She bowed her head in true prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I know I haven't spoken to you proper since they sent me away. I was angry, hurt, thought you'd abandoned me." Tears fell onto her clasped hands. "But you sent me Enoch. You gave me a home, a purpose. Please, please don't let it all be taken away. Don't abandon us now." The crickets sang in the gathering dusk. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and sage, of the land that had become her home. Behind her, through the cabin window, lamplight glowed warm and steady, like Enoch's love, like the faith she felt stirring back to life in her heart. "I ain't asking for myself," she continued softly. "But Enoch, he's done nothing but good. He deserves his land, his home." She touched her middle again, hope mixing with fear. "And if you've blessed us as I suspect, our child deserves a father's." Roof overhead. The stars multiplied above her as she prayed, each one a pinpoint of light in the vast darkness. Like her mother used to say, God hung every star, and he knew them all by name. Surely he knew her too, knew the truth of her marriage, the legitimacy of their love. Dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when hoofbeats thundered toward the cabin. Enoch and Miriam, still dressed from their sleepless night, rose from there. Chairs by the cold hearth. Through the window, they watched Sheriff Doyle approach with 4 armed men. Silas Keller rode behind them, triumph gleaming in his eyes. The morning air bit sharp and cold as Enoch stepped onto the porch. Miriam closed behind him. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining with quiet strength. "Morning, Hart," Sheriff Doyle called out, dismounting with a grunt. He wouldn't meet their eyes as he pulled papers from his vest. "Got some legal matters need attending." Silas spurred his horse forward, that snake smile playing across his face. "Told you we'd be seeing about this land, didn't I?" The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "According to these documents, there's question of rightful ownership. Until the territorial court sorts it out, we're here to secure the property." "This is my land," Enoch said, his voice steady despite the fear Miriam felt trembling through his fingers. "Been working it 5 years now. Got the deed in that trunk yonder." "A deed that wasn't filed proper," Silas cut in. "Just like that so-called marriage of yours ain't worth the paper it's written on. Tell me, boy, how's a simple-minded virgin like yourself expect to hold on to anything?" Enoch's face flushed red, but he stood his ground. Sheriff Doyle shifted in his saddle, glancing between the men. "Now, miss," the sheriff paused, uncertain what to call her, "the lady will need to leave the premises until this matter's settled. Can't have unauthorized persons occupying disputed property." "She's my wife," Enoch's voice cracked with emotion. "This is her home." One of Silas's men laughed, striking a match against his saddle. The torch in his hand caught with a whoosh. "Ain't nobody's home if it burns down," he drawled. Miriam's legs gave way. She sank to the porch boards, tears streaming down her face. All her fears crashed over her like a wave. She had brought this upon them. Her unworthiness, her failure to be properly chosen, had cursed Enoch's peaceful life. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Enoch. This is my fault. They're right about me. I'm nothing but trouble, just like my family said." Enoch knelt beside her, gathering her close against his chest. His heart beat strong and steady under her ear. "No," he whispered fierce and low. "You're everything I prayed for. Everything good in my life." He looked up at the mounted men, steel in his gentle eyes. "We ain't running." The sheriff made a frustrated sound. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Art. Just clear out peaceful-like until the court decides." More torches flared in the growing light. Miriam could smell pitch and oil, could imagine their little home going up in flames. The careful shelves Enoch had built, the garden she tended, the bed they shared. Her heart squeezed painfully in her chest. "Give us an hour," Enoch said quietly. To gather what's ours by right. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. 1 hour. Then we escort the lady to town. Inside their cabin, Miriam moved with desperate efficiency. She and Enoch pried up the loose floorboard where they kept their precious things. His mother's Bible, a psalter, a small bag of coins they'd saved. Her fingers brushed the scrap of apron Enoch had saved from his mother, and fresh tears. Spilled working together, they buried their valuables in the root cellar, marking the spot with a broken horseshoe. The morning crept forward like molasses in winter, each minute precious and painful. Through it all, they moved in perfect unity, sharing glances heavy with meaning. This place had transformed them both, from lonely outcasts to partners, from strangers to beloved. The walls might burn, but what they built between their hearts was fireproof. As the hour drew to a close, they stood in the center of their one room. Morning light streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Miriam touched the rough-hewn table where they'd shared meals, the shelf that held her preserves, the bed where they'd learned to trust. Even if they burn it all, she whispered, her voice stronger than she felt, I still belong to you. No paper can change that. No court can rule on what God has joined. Enoch's arms came around her, solid as the mountains themselves. Outside, they could hear the men growing. Restless, horses stamping in the dirt. But in this moment, they were anchored in something deeper than fear. They sat together on their bed, hands clasped tight as shadows of torches flickered on the walls. Neither spoke. There was no need. Whatever came next, they would face it. As one, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples when a distant rumble caught Miriam's attention. She and Enoch stepped onto the porch, his arm protectively around her waist. Through the morning mist, they saw a crowd approaching, wagons, riders, and people on foot streaming up the rough trail to their cabin. At the front rode Preacher Morgan, his black coat stark against his dappled mar. Behind him came what looked like half the town, faces both familiar and strange in the growing light. Some carried lanterns that bobbed like fireflies in the dim morning. Silas cursed under his breath, wheeling his horse around to face the newcomers. The sheriff's men lowered their torches, uncertain. What's all this then? Silas demanded as the preacher dismounted. Word travels fast in small towns, Preacher Morgan said, his voice carrying clearly in the cool morning air. These good folks heard you meant to burn out a God-fearing couple without proper hearing. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife who had praised Miriam's pie at the gathering, stepped forward. Ain't right, she declared. They've done nothing but work hard and show kindness. The law's the law, Silas snapped, waving his papers. I've got documents proving this land's mine. Then you won't mind presenting them proper like in town, the preacher replied. He turned to Sheriff Doyle. These matters should be settled in the light of day, with witnesses, not at torch point in the dark. The sheriff tugged at his collar, looking between the angry faces of the townspeople and Silas's darkening scowl. Reckon the preacher's got a point, he said finally. We'll hold a proper hearing. Miriam felt her knees go weak with relief. Enoch's arm tightened around her, holding her steady as always. The morning air still carried the acrid smell of pitch from the unlit torches, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Best get mounted up then, the preacher said kindly to Enoch and Miriam. We'll all ride in together. With trembling hands, Miriam gathered her shawl while Enoch saddled their old mule. The borrowed creature was nothing fancy, but it had carried them faithfully to church each Sunday. Now it would carry them to face whatever justice awaited in town. Enoch helped her up, then swung on behind her. The familiar warmth of his chest against her back gave her courage. As they set out, Miriam couldn't help looking back at their little cabin. It stood peaceful in the growing light, smoke still curling from the chimney. She prayed it wouldn't be the last time she saw it. The strange procession wound its way down the trail, Silas and his men in front. Then the sheriff followed, by Enoch and Miriam on their mule, with the preacher and townspeople bringing up the rear. The unlit torches still smoldered, trailing thin wisps of smoke that caught the morning light dot as they entered town. More people emerged from shops and homes. They lined the street, whispering behind their hands. Miriam held her head high, though. Her heart pounded. She caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Shame to treat them so. But what about the papers? Never caused no trouble. The church stood waiting, its white-painted boards gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, the pews had been pushed back, creating a makeshift courtroom. Miriam's legs shook as she dismounted, but Enoch's steady hand on her elbow kept her upright. They sat together on the front pew while people filed in, filling the small building to bursting. The sheriff took his place behind the pulpit, with Preacher Morgan beside him. Silas strode forward, slapping his papers down on the altar rail. These documents show clear as day, he announced, that this land was improperly filed. The original claims invalid, meaning it reverts to me as the nearest landowner. The sheriff examined the papers while murmurs rippled through the crowd. Miriam watched the morning light stream through the colored windows, painting patterns on the floor. The same windows had shone down on her first Sunday here when she'd felt so lost and alone. She felt a gentle pressure on her shoulder and looked up to find Preacher Morgan standing beside her. His kind eyes met hers, and he nodded encouragingly. Perhaps, he said loudly enough for all to hear, we should hear from Mrs. Hart herself. The room fell silent. Miriam felt every eye turned to her, just as they had in her Amish community, just as they had when she first stepped off the stage. But this time was different. This time she had something worth fighting for. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Her hands twisted in her apron, but her voice remained steady as she prepared to speak. The time had come to defend not just her marriage, but her very place in the world. She took a deep breath, feeling Enoch's unwavering support beside her, and opened her mouth to tell their story. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through the colored windows as Silas paced before the makeshift court. His boots thudded against the wooden floor with each forceful step. These papers prove it plain as day, he declared, voice echoing off the walls. Art's claim was filed wrong from the start. Man can barely write his own name. How's he supposed to homestead proper? He jabbed a finger toward Enoch. And this so-called marriage? Nothing but a mail-order mess with no standing. The sheriff studied the documents, frowning as he shuffled through the papers. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning cool. The townspeople packed into the pews shifted restlessly, whispering among themselves. Miriam felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Enoch beside her, saw the muscle working in his jaw as he struggled to stay calm. His large hands were clenched into fists on his knees, but still he remained silent, patient. Well now, Sheriff Doyle said slowly, these papers do seem to show some irregularities in the filing. A satisfied smirk spread across Silas's face. Of course they do. Which means both land and marriage are null and void. Miriam felt something snap inside her chest. All her life, she'd been told to stay quiet, to accept what others decided. But not this time. Not when everything she loved hung in the balance. She rose to her feet, her skirts rustling in the sudden silence. Her legs trembled beneath her, but her voice rang clear through the church. I may not have fancy words, she began, her Pennsylvania Dutch accent thick with emotion. And I know well enough what folks see when they look at me. She smoothed her hands over her broad skirts. But I tell you true, I am Enoch Hart's wife in the eyes of God and man both. The crowd stirred. Miriam drew a deep breath and continued, gaining strength with each word. The Lord led me here across half a continent. Me, who never thought to be chosen by any man. Her voice caught, but she pushed on. But Enoch, he saw past what others scorned. He gave me a home when my own folk cast me out. Together we've worked that land, made it bloom. Tears spilled down her cheeks now, but she held her head high. You can mock my size, mock his simple ways. But I tell you this, God himself brought us together. And what God has joined, let no man tear asunder. A heavy silence fell over the church. Even Silas seemed taken aback by her bold testimony. But then his trademark sneer returned. Pretty speech, he drawled. But the law's the law, and these papers are forgeries. A new voice cut in. All heads turned toward the back of the church. A well-dressed man Miriam had never seen before stood up, leather satchel in hand. He made his way down the center aisle, boots clicking on the wooden floor. Name's Theodore Walsh, he announced. Territorial circuit lawyer. Been tracking a series of land fraud cases across 3 counties. He reached into his satchel, producing a thick folder. And I've got the authentic records right here. The sheriff took the new papers with visible relief. Walsh continued. Enoch Hart's claim was filed proper and legal 5 years back. And that marriage broker? Licensed and bonded in Pennsylvania. I've got those papers too. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Silas's face turned an ugly shade of purple. This is nonsense, he sputtered. You can't just ride in here and... I can and I did, Walsh replied calmly. And I'll be looking into those other claims you've been making on folks' land, Mr. Keller. Seems there's quite a pattern. The sheriff straightened his spine, finding his courage at last. Silas Keller, I'm ordering you to leave these premises. And don't you go near the Hart property again, or you'll answer to me. 2 deputies stepped forward, hands on their gun belts. Silas glared around the room, but even his most loyal men were backing away. With a curse, he stormed out, slamming the church door behind him. Miriam's legs gave way. She sank onto the pew, tears flowing freely now. Enoch's strong arm went around her shoulders, drawing her close. His own eyes shone with moisture as he pressed. A kiss to her temple. The preacher's voice rose above the excited chatter of the crowd. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he declared. But justice prevails for those who keep faith. Miriam clutched Enoch's rough hand in both of hers, feeling the calluses earned from honest work. Through her tears, she saw Mrs. Peterson beaming at them, and the baker nodding approval, and even the sheriff looking shamefaced but relieved they were safe. Their home was secure. And she, Miriam Stoltzfus Hart, had finally found her voice. And her place in the world. The wagon wheels creaked as Enoch and Miriam made their way back to their homestead. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the trail, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the foothills. Behind them, 3 more wagons followed. Neighbors who had insisted on helping Dot as they crested the final rise. Miriam's heart clenched at the sight of their little shack. Scorch marks marred the outer walls where Silas's men had threatened with torches, and the fence lay broken in places. But smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Someone had gone ahead to light the hearth. Look there, Enoch said softly, pointing to figures moving in their yard. More neighbors had gathered, carrying baskets and tools. Mrs. Peterson hurried forward as they pulled up, her gray hair escaping her bonnet. We couldn't wait, she explained, reaching for Miriam's hand. The Williams brought flour and the Tuckers had dried beans to spare. Even old Mr. Jenkins contributed some preserves. Tears welled in Miriam's eyes as she climbed down from the wagon. On their rough-hewn table, neighbors had laid out offerings, sacks of cornmeal, jars of preserved fruit, even a small crock of butter. Each gift represented sacrifice from families who had little to spare. You stood brave today, Mrs. Peterson whispered, squeezing Miriam's plump hand. We were wrong to judge so quick. You're one of us now." While the women organized the provisions, Enoch and the men set to work. The sound of hammers rang out as they replaced scorched boards and mended the broken fence. Young Tommy Tucker scrambled up to patch the roof where sparks had burned through, while his father straightened the door frame that had been twisted in the struggle. Miriam moved to her Dutch oven, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her hands. She added fresh water, dried beef, and vegetables, watching the stew begin to simmer. The rich aroma filled the cabin, drawing appreciative sniffs from the workers dotted in the corner. Enoch labored over a special project. His big hands, usually more, suited to rough work, moved with surprising delicacy as he shaped pieces of pine into a cross. He had saved the wood from the first tree they had felled together on their land. Each cut was measured carefully, each edge smoothed with patient care. As the sun began to set, the neighbors gathered inside the small cabin. The space was crowded but warm with bodies and goodwill. Miriam ladled stew into every bowl they owned, then into cups when the bowls ran out. No one seemed to mind the makeshift vessels. Enoch stood on a chair, reaching up to mount his finished cross above the hearth. The firelight caught the fresh-cut wood, making it glow golden. He stepped back, satisfaction plain on his honest face. "It's perfect," Miriam said softly, and he beamed at her praise. As darkness fell, their guests began to depart, leaving behind a home that felt more solid than before. The fence stood straight again, the walls were sound, and the pantry was fuller than they had ever seen it. In the quiet that followed, Miriam and Enoch sat before the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Miriam began to hum the hymn she had learned at her mother's knee. The German words came back to her, carrying memories of her Amish childhood. "Gott ist die Lieb, laat mich erlösen, Gott ist die Lieb, a liebt euch mich." Enoch's deep voice joined hers on the second verse, uncertain but willing. Though he didn't know the words, he followed her lead, their voices twining together in the firelit cabin. The melody spoke of God's love and redemption, of being found after feeling lost. Miriam's voice trembled but grew stronger with each line. This wasn't the life she had imagined as a young girl in Lancaster County. It was better, harder in some ways, richer in others. Here, she wasn't the awkward, overweight girl who would never be chosen. Here, she was Enoch's wife, trusted neighbor, keeper of hearth and home. Looking around their small cabin, she saw not poverty but promise. The shelves held food given in friendship. The mended walls spoke of neighbors' care. The cross above the hearth declared God's presence. Even the rough floor beneath her feet felt different. This wasn't the ground where she had been cast out, but soil where she had been deliberately planted, where she could grow strong and put down roots. Enoch reached for her hand as the last notes of the hymn faded. In the firelight, his eyes shone with contentment and love. Together, they sat in peaceful silence, watching the flames dance beneath their new cross. Two lonely souls finally and firmly home. The aspen leaves turned to gold as autumn settled over the Colorado foothills. Morning frost sparkled on the garden, where Miriam and Enoch worked side by side, gathering the last vegetables before winter. Their root cellar grew full with potatoes, carrots, and squash, enough to share with neighbors who had stood by them. "Look what the Petersons sent," Enoch said one afternoon, holding up fresh churned butter wrapped in cloth. "Trade for them. Turnips we gave last week." Miriam smiled, remembering how different things had been just months ago. Now their little shack had become known as a place of refuge. Travelers would stop, drawn by the smoke from their chimney and the scent of fresh bread. Miriam never turned anyone away hungry. One crisp evening, a knock came at their door. Sarah Miller stood there, a widow with 3 small children huddled close. Their clothes were worn, their faces tired from the road. "We've nowhere else," Sarah whispered, Eyes downcast up, Miriam reached out, taking Sarah's cold hand. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." The children's eyes grew wide at the sight of fresh bread and stew. While the women talked quietly by the fire, Enoch entertained the little ones, letting them ride on his broad shoulders and teaching them to whittle small toys from pine scraps. Watching him with the children, Miriam felt her heart swell. She touched the wooden cross above the hearth, remembering her own arrival as a frightened outcast. Now she could offer others what had been given to her: acceptance without judgment, rest without price. "God gave me a home when I had none," she murmured to Sarah. "Now he's helped us make this place a home for others too." Sarah squeezed her hand in understanding as laughter from Enoch and the children filled the warm cabin. The first snowflakes drifted past, their window like feathers in the night air. Inside the snug cabin, the fire crackled low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Miriam sat in her rocking chair, the one Enoch had crafted for her with careful hands, while he perched on the bench beside her. Between them, their family Bible lay open, its pages glowing in the warm lamplight. Enoch's finger traced the verses, slowly, his lips moving as he read from the Psalms. Miriam's hand rested in his free one, their fingers intertwined. Through the window, moonlight transformed their valley into a silver paradise. Fresh snow blanketed the garden where they had labored together, covering the mended fence and the scorched boards they had replaced. The aspens stood like white sentinels against the dark sky, their bare branches catching the crystalline flakes. "I remember," Miriam said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I thought I would never know peace like this." She touched the worn pages of the Bible. "That morning in Lancaster, watching my father's wagon disappear, I believed I had been cast aside forever." Enoch lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her fingers. His eyes, clear and earnest as always, met hers. "You were never cast aside," he said, his deep voice full of conviction. "You were chosen by God and given to me." Tears glimmered in Miriam's eyes, catching the lamplight like diamonds. They bowed their heads together, their prayers rising silent and sure in the quiet cabin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a reminder of grace made new. The cabin stood peaceful in the Colorado night, smoke curling from its chimney like a silver ribbon against the dark sky. Through the window, lamplight spilled onto the fresh snow, golden and warm. And then, carried on the crisp mountain air, the sound of hymns drifted across the valley. Their voices joined in praise, echoing the same songs that had once filled a distant Amish church. Together, they sang of mercy, of finding home, of prayers answered in God's perfect time. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.